All right, so now that we've decided on a basic structure for the data in our database and how we're going to express ownership over the notes in our database, the next thing we need to do is actually rewrite some of the endpoints in our backend to take that into account. Now, to show you what I mean by this, the first thing we're going to do is open up our list notes route and make a few changes here. Okay, so the first change we're going to make here is instead of having the path just be /notes, we're going to have to change it a little bit to express the fact that we don't want all of the notes from the database. All we want is all of the notes for a specific user. Now, to keep this in line with the basic conventions of REST APIs, what I'm going to suggest we do is change the path from /notes to /users/user ID, which we're going to use as a URL parameter here, and then we'll say /notes. So essentially, again, in RESTful convention, what this says is we want all of the notes for the user with this ID here. And that'll look something like this. We'll say users/123/notes, and that will give us all of the notes that user123 has created. All right, so that's our basic plan with the path here. So the next thing we're going to need to do is take that into account in the actual handler for this route. So the change we're going to need to make here, the first thing we're going to need to do is get the value of this user ID URL parameter out of the path, right? And the way that we do that, we've seen this in other routes before. We're going to say const user ID equals request.params, and that will give us the URL parameter values for the current request that we're processing. Okay, so now that we have the ID of the user that we want to load the notes for, the next thing we need to do is change the way that we're interacting with this database. Okay, now we have this notesDB thing, which basically is just a reference to our notes collection in MongoDB. However, remember that when we inserted the user and the information about the notes that they owned, we inserted that into a different collection, which was the users collection. So let's just open that up again here. We're going to say use notes app.db, and we'll say db.users.find.pretty. We see that the IDs of the notes that this user, with whatever ID it is that we have here from the URL parameters, owns, are inside the user's collection. So what we're going to need to do here is add something to the DB file of our backend. And instead of just giving access to the notes DB, we're going to also have to give access to the users DB. So what we can do in order to make that happen is say export let users DB equals null. And then just like we did for our notes DB, we're going to say users DB equals client.db notes app DB, and we'll say .collection users. Okay, and that will give us the same reference to the users collection in MongoDB as we had with our notes collection earlier. One other thing that we can do here too, by the way, is actually reduce a little bit of the repeated code by just saying const db equals client.db notes app DB. That way, if we were to change the DB name, we would just have to change it one spot, and then we can just say db.collection notes and db.collection users, and it's just a little bit easier. It's not a big deal since we're going to make very few changes generally to this file here, but, you know, it helps out a little bit. So now that we've exported this users DB thing, we're going to have to change our list notes route to use that instead of the notes DB. Well, in fact, we're going to have to use both because we're going to have to get each of the notes with the corresponding IDs that we have from our user once we load it. And I'll show you what I mean here in a moment by that, but we're going to say users DB. And the first thing that we're going to do is load the user by their user ID. And to do that, we'll say const user equals await users db.find. And we'll use find1 here since we're only expecting there to be one user with that ID. And for this, we're going to say ID equals whatever the user ID that we got in the URL parameters was. Okay? So that will give us our user with the corresponding ID. So the next thing that we need to do is get the notes IDs that are on this user object, which remember are just going to be an array of IDs of the notes that the user actually owns. And we're going to need to actually translate those into the corresponding notes in our DB. So we want this to become an actual database object with all the information for note 1, 2, 3. We want this to become an actual note with all the information for note 2, 3, 4, etc. You get the idea. So the way that we're going to do this is actually a surprisingly tricky thing, and here's why. Our first inclination for this, our first instinct maybe, might be to do something like this and say const notes equals user.notes.map. And since we know that each of those is a note ID, we could just say notes db.find, and maybe that would be find one, and we would find the note by its ID. Now that looks straightforward. However, because this operation here is asynchronous, we have to use a slightly different syntax in order to make this work. Now, when you're doing things like populating data in MongoDB, it's very important that you're familiar with a function in JavaScript called promise.all. Now, I'm not going to go too far in depth with what promises are in JavaScript. That's a topic that could probably span several sections in itself. But basically, promises are the mechanism behind using async and await. So the problem with using map in conjunction with an asynchronous function like this one is that what this function actually returns here is a promise. Now, a promise in JavaScript is basically just an asynchronous operation that has yet to complete. So what we want to do is wait for each of these operations to complete before returning our notes array here. Now again, your first inclination here might be to do something like add async and await to these things, and unfortunately it's not actually that easy, I'm sorry to say. That was my first inclination too when I started doing things like this. It just doesn't work, I'm sorry to say. What we have to do instead is use the promise.all function, which I just talked about, to basically translate all of the promises that we're returning here into the results that they provide. Now again, I'm not going to go too much into detail with that. For now, just know that you have to wrap this thing in promise.all, and that will take care of waiting for all of these requests here to complete, and it will return all of the corresponding notes for those IDs in this variable here. Now we do have to say await here because promise.all itself returns a promise that is only going to be fulfilled when all of the asynchronous operations it represents, in other words, these things here, are fulfilled. I hope I'm not confusing you, by the way. If I am, just ignore this for now. This is just one of the slightly complicated things that we run into when dealing with multiple collections and trying to take IDs from one and translate them into objects in another. Okay, so we have our notes now, and that means we can remove this other line here that we were using before, and now we just have to send those back to the user, which we're doing with this line. So that should be good for our list notes route. If you want to test this thing, what you can do is we're just going to run our server here by, here we go, I'm just going to say npm run dev. And in fact, since we just want to run the server for now, let's just open up our backend directory and say npm run dev in there. And we should be able to test this thing by sending a request to users / and then whatever the user ID is we want to access / notes. So let me just find that user ID real quick by saying Mongo. Again, we're going to say use notes app db, and we'll say db.users.find, and we'll just steal the user's ID property here, the ID, not the underscore ID. That's just Mongo's automatically assigned ID that we're going to ignore for now. So we're going to take this ID. And what you can do now is if you open up a browser and go to localhost 8080/users and then paste that ID /notes, you should see the information come back for all of the notes that the user owns. Okay? And that's how we rewrite our list notes endpoint to take into account our new concept of ownership in our application. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.